Welcome everybody, thanks for joining us. Welcome to Marxism Festival 2021 online, and a special welcome to this meeting on Ireland, the legacy of partition and the case for unification. My name is Ruby. I'll be chairing today's meeting. I'm a member of the Socialist Workers' Party in Waltham Forest in northeast London. So welcome, it's great to see everybody joining us. And it's also my pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Kieran Allen, who is a Secretary of People Before Profit and a member of the Socialist Workers Network. Just to let you know how this meeting will be run. I know this might be some people's first meeting of the day, so Kieran will lead us off and speak for about 25 minutes, and then there'll be plenty of time for questions and contributions from the floor, and the speaker will come back for about 5 minutes at the end to sum up. So please be aware the chat function is currently switched off just for security reasons, but if you would prefer to put your question or contribution in the chat, you can send it to me directly or one of the co-hosts, and we will read it out if there's time. Otherwise, you can indicate that you would like to speak by raising your virtual hand at any point, and we'll call people during the discussion. So I'll explain a bit more after the speaker leads off about how that'll all work. So yeah, now it's time to hand over to Kieran. So please start when you're ready. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Ruby, and thanks for inviting me here. Let me bring you sympathy from the Irish left watching the deeply depressing scenes of Tory victories in places like Hartlepool, and my commiseration that you have such a miserable character called Starmer leading what purports to be a Labour Party. But in the excitement of the election, you may not have noticed there's also an election occurring in Northern Ireland. It'll be a constituency of about, I think, less than 40 people will vote on it, and it will be to decide the leader of the DUP. And the leading candidate, not a familiar name probably in Britain, is a man called Edwin Poots, who believes that the world began 4,000 years ago because it was written in the Bible, and that Adam and Eve was sent into the Garden of Eden, and this wasn't just a story, it was the real truth. He also thinks that gay people are an abomination, that they should be banned from giving blood, and he also thinks that Catholics are more like, was it again? 6 times more likely to contract COVID than Protestants, and in fact they may be indeed responsible for the surge in COVID cases in the north. This is pretty extraordinary stuff. But you have to ask, how could such a political leader emerge in a main political party in part of these two islands? And I would argue it really reflects a very deep strain of conservatism that has existed on both parts of Ireland for decades. If we look, for example, at the history of Northern Ireland, we find that from 1922 to 1972, it was run as a one-party state where only one bill was ever passed in its whole period, which was the Wild Birds Act in 1934, if I remember. Wild Birds being neither Protestants nor Catholics. That was the only bill that was ever passed in the whole history of the northern state. And if we look south of the border, we find an equally bizarre setup, which is that for most of that period, for all that period, from the foundation of the state to today, it has been run by 2 right-wing parties, Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael, with help now of the Green Party, in the past the Labour Party, who have identical politics, who have extreme right-wing politics, who believe, for example, when it comes to a health service, that if you're poor, you may be let have treatment in a relatively a service you'll wait for quite a long time. But if you can take out health insurance, you will be treated by a consultant before anybody else. A system in the South where, for example, to this day, 95% of primary schools are run by the Catholic Church. In fact, there is no national state-run school system for young children. So this is a legacy of a partition arrangement that emerged from dividing the country based on supposed identities of one culture in the north and one culture in the south. Now, this the question we have to ask, first of all, is, okay, so a country was divided on the basis of identity. What exactly identity are you talking about? And what is the basis of this division today? And one of the first arguments you get is, well, there were Protestants in the north and the south is run by Catholics. And there's an awful difference in culture between Catholics who are a bit shifty and Protestants who are a bit straight. Yeah, but hang on. We now know that in the south of Ireland, less than 20% of people in the city of Dublin go to Mass every Sunday. We know in terms of the north that about 42% of Protestants attend church. So religion is hardly a factor in explaining the actual division. The other way the conversation has shifted is to talk about, I'll just see if I can find this book here, is to talk about two different and distinct cultures that exist in terms of the north and the south. And just because I produced a book on it for this anniversary, I also looked at my rivals who have also produced a book. And there's a book here by a man called Charles Townshend called Partition. He's one of the more prominent British historians. And he's kind of discussing this idea of two cultures, you know, between the north and the south, which he claims, he says, in fact, he says partition of Ireland was not inevitable, but logical. Notice the nice upper class way of speaking. Not inevitable, we know that, but logical. And then he goes on to explain to us why it might be logical. And he writes, and I'm quoting him, he says that the Ulster man, not women, I'm afraid, the Ulster man, this is a distinct identity he talks about, took on a special culture where they had, I'm quoting him, a special character, a heritage, and a destiny, unlike those in the south. And then he quotes another prominent historian. Funny enough, a lot of conventional historians play quite an important role in giving ideological justification for partition. And this time he quotes quite a prominent historian, Marion Elliott, who tries to define for us what is the specific character of this culture that differentiates the north of Ireland from the south of Ireland. And she says, I'm quoting him, the Ulster man, men again, have a peculiar accent, a blunt manner, a Philistine outlook on life, and an intransigent frame of mind. So this, if you like, cultural difference is supposed to explain why we have partition. It doesn't really stack up for a number of reasons. First of all, there was no agreement historically on the exact border of the present Northern Ireland before it actually, until it emerged in 1921. In 1912, for example, the first proposal for partition was based on the idea of 4 counties. After that, Edward Carson, the person who led the Unionist movement, proposed 9 counties. And eventually it settled on 6 counties because, as James Craig, the first Prime Minister of the North, explained, that is as much territory we could hold in perpetuity, this was his argument, in perpetuity, forever, that would have enough Protestants, enough Unionists to hold that territory, and yet, this is the crucial point, have a substantial internal enemy, namely nationalists, who made up 1/3 of the population, and the existence of this internal enemy would make it easier for probably one of the most right-wing parties in Europe, certainly at the time, the Unionist Party, to consolidate its base amongst the Protestant population, and indeed to destroy any challenge from even the Labour Party at the time in the north. So that is how partition was set up. Now, there's one element of the story I've just left out there, which is, and this is when we hear these debates about there are 2 cultures, which finds logical expression in partition, the thing that slips off the analysis is, yeah, but what role did the British Empire play in this? Was the British Empire simply a mediator? And this is often how imperial stories are told, that the British Empire goes out to India, where there are terrible tribal conflicts, or Ireland, and its main role is to mediate and bring civilization to these unfortunate people. But that's not quite what happened in Ireland. And when we look historically, it's important to understand that the partition of Ireland arose from an anti-democratic, extreme right-wing movement of the Tory party in Britain, forming an alliance with the Orange Order to essentially scupper a very moderate home rule deal, which was less than the autonomy given to Scotland, for example, up to recent times. Let me explain. There's a brilliant book I'd recommend people read called The Strange Death of Liberal England by George Dangerfield, who points out that in the beginning of the 20th century, British imperialism faced two main crises. One was how to incorporate the working class, which had just won, by the way, the right to suffrage, the right to vote. And secondly, how to manage an empire, given that the first revolt, the Boer revolt had occurred. How exactly were they to manage these twin problems? The Liberal Party argued the main way to do that was to incorporate the working class, to, if you like, appear to bend to some working class demands, to incorporate the idea of the Lib Labs at the time, and in terms of the empire, to move to a more federal system where there would be some degree of autonomy. The Tory party took the opposite view. The Tory party's a solution to this crisis of the British Empire at the time was to whip up chauvinism in the working class, to find a base in the working class in terms of respect for empire, respect for the aristocracy, respect for the Queen or the King at the time, and to, in terms of the empire, really cut down on any attempt to give any autonomy whatsoever to those within the empire. And one result of that is the Tory party decided that they would form this alliance with the Unionists, with Carson, who, by the way, was one of the most extremely reactionary political figures on these islands. Carson was known as Coercion Carson, for essentially trying to criminalize tenants who resisted landlord demands. He was famously involved in the jailing of Oscar Wilde, the writer. He was a main opponent of the 1906 Trade Union Act, which gave immunities to the right of trade unionists to strike. He was an appalling right-wing character. But the Tories formed an alliance with Carson, and as they did so, they essentially upped the stakes, even in terms of British democracy. Let me just read to you what Bonar Law said when he inspected the mass ranks of the Unionist movement in the North in 1912. He says that the attempt by the Liberal government to bring in, first of all, a Parliament Act which would have removed the veto of the House of Lords, and secondly, to introduce Home Rule, he said, I'm quoting him, he says, "This is a revolutionary committee," the Liberal Party, not any Soviets in London, "a revolutionary committee which has seized power by fraud upon despotic power. In our opposition to them, the Tories and the Unionist movement, we shall not be guided by any consideration which would influence us in ordinary political struggle. We shall use any means to deprive them of the power they usurped." And when he says any means, he meant it. The Tories got on to, for example, the officers of the British Army in the North, in Ireland, and essentially fomented a mutiny against any attempt to move against unionism. So the point I want to make is that partition emerged not from two cultures, but from the most reactionary element in British politics, the Tories, who formed an alliance with the Unionist Party to undermine even democracy in Britain. Any attempt to talk about devolution, even within the empire. And what we have today is not a cultural legacy. We have a political legacy of people who were hoodwinked and duped into supporting an empire that has solidified and calcified in terms of the North, producing these two identity blocks, which in reality, when you deconstruct it, there isn't much behind it. Now, the interesting thing is that on the centenary of partition, it's at this point that partition has come under most question, is more unstable than at any point in its last 100 years. Why? Three reasons I want to suggest is really undermining partition at the moment. The first is Brexit. So it's a truism that Boris Johnson took Britain out of the EU, but Boris Johnson, in doing that, has risked the breakup of the United Kingdom, so-called United Kingdom. That's certainly an element to it, but there's something much more specific than that. In order to win the leadership of the Tory party, Boris Johnson formed an alliance with the Brexiteers, the hard right of the party, and with the Democratic Unionist Party in the north. He turned up to their conference in 2018 and he said, and I quote him, he says he would never allow a border to appear in the Irish Sea because that would, to quote Mr. Johnson, that would be turning the north into a semi-colony of the EU. And he went on to say, we would be damaging the fabric of the Union with regulatory checks and even custom controls between Great Britain and Northern Ireland. And with emphasis, he says, I have to tell you that no British government could or should sign up to any such arrangement. And what did Johnson do? He did precisely that. He signed up to such an arrangement. And who was responsible for putting in these regulatory checks? None other than Edwin Poots began the process. So this obviously has produced an immense disillusionment, sense of betrayal amongst many Protestant workers at the moment. So that's one thing that's undermining partition. Deep demoralization, deep sense of insecurity in terms of, if you like, revealing what the real attitude of the British Tories is to people in the north. The second main reason for the change is what has happened in the south. And if you like, the traditional argument for partition is we do not want to be overrun by the papists in the south who are controlled by the Pope of Rome. We would be completely in a priest-ridden society. You look at the north, so you look at the south today, and you find what? That the south is the first country in the world by popular suffrage to vote for marriage equality. The south voted by 2/3 to 1/3 to legalize abortion against the full power of the Catholic Church. So the idea that the south represents the papists controlled by the priests, it doesn't really stack up. So that in itself is producing a different outlook for many people. And the third reason is a bit more crude, but it's just a fact. The Unionist Party has lost its majority in Northern Ireland in 2017. They no longer are a majority in the north. The census, which will appear, I think, in the next months or so, will show that Protestants are now a minority in a state that was set up to be a Protestant parliament for a Protestant people. Now, in most countries, you know, who cares whether somebody's a Catholic or Protestant, Muslim, Hindu, and so on? In the north, that produces an intense feeling of insecurity and undermines the very basis of the actual state itself. So from my viewpoint, partition is going to go, whether it goes the next 5, 10, 15 years, but there's a real questioning throughout the island that partition is going to end. But the real question is, well, how might it end? How will that actually happen? How could you envisage a united Ireland taking place? And here I want to refer to really what I think are two mistaken approaches to a united Ireland and what I think is the argument of the radical left at the moment. Okay, let's look at the first mistaken approach. I'm really here dealing with the arguments of Irish republicanism. When the armed struggle was underway for many decades in the north, the traditional argument of the Republican movement was that Protestants could play no progressive role in Ireland until after the border was removed. In other words, the border and partition would have to be removed against their will, and this idea often harked back to an argument made by Michael Farrell in his book, The Orange State, otherwise, by the way, an excellent book, but it characterized Protestants essentially as the equivalent of the Pieds Noirs, the colonial settlers in Algeria, and assumed, therefore, that they could play no role in bringing about a united Ireland. I don't think that argument is feasible. There's 900,000 Protestants in this country. If it faces massive opposition from them, it'd be difficult to see how a united Ireland is going to be brought about simply against their will. And therefore, at least a section of Protestant workers will need to move to embracing the idea of a united Ireland. The second mistaken argument, however, is what's emerged recently in Republican politics, which is what probably best to call it a strategy of love bombing orange culture. In other words, the idea is that we, the Republicans, are going to give the hand of friendship to the Orange Order, which represents the Protestant community. And we're going to say that in a united Ireland, you can maintain your orange culture. You can you have your right to parade wherever you want to parade, and you can maintain your loyalty to the Queen. We will give, I'm just quoting the Sinn Féin document here, we will give expression to the relationship between Unionists and the British monarchy in the political structure of a united Ireland. These, by the way, is quite extraordinary statements from an organisation that comes from the Republican tradition. Now, the reason why this emerges is that in more recent times, Sinn Féin, which has quite a support base both north and south, now thinks that the way to Irish unity is through the agency of the southern state, that the southern state becomes the prime mover in pushing Irish unity, in having a conversation with the Orange Order, by the way, a reactionary institution that is still to this day excludes women from its membership, and that this orange culture somehow represents Protestant workers, and therefore we have to show that we are in tune with this culture by, and here we find some interesting shifts in Republican politics these days, by, for example, writing to the Queen on the on the occasion of the death of her husband, by apologizing for going behind a banner which says Brits out, by not opposing special criminal courts, all of this to show that we are so moderate as Republicans that there's no threat to Protestant workers. Yeah, but still, a Protestant worker is going to say, would you really trust these people? And what's more, I've got it, Ruby, you don't have a proper health service and you have a housing crisis. Why would I want to come into a United Ireland where I wait 3 years for a hip operation, or as it is the case in Dublin at the moment, you wait 12 years on average to get a council house? Why would I want to come into such an Ireland? And therefore, it's important to say what the argument of the radical left is. And I want to really finish on this point. And he's very much to stand in the tradition of James Connolly and to argue that we want to see an Ireland that is not about stitching together the North and the South. It is about a fundamental challenge to both rotten states, not just one state, but both rotten states. It is about challenging the notion that the south of Ireland is a tax haven run for bankers and speculators and the wealthy, and that working class people in the south of Ireland pay for that with terrible services, where, for example, you pay €1,000 a month to have your child go to a creche in Dublin, or you find the dearest bus fares in Dublin of the whole city of Europe. So this is the argument we're making to Protestant workers. Now, the last point I'm going to make is this. What is the chance of that having any success? And here I want to just emphasize how the situation facing Protestant workers has changed absolutely dramatically. When I began this book, I hadn't actually looked at the statistics, but when I did look at statistics, you find today that in terms of Protestant access to jobs and Catholic access to jobs, there is virtually no difference. Protestants no longer have access to skilled labor, and Catholics being unskilled building workers. So that has gone. When we look at the actual average wage of a Protestant and a Catholic, we find there is now effective equality, but it is equality of poverty. The actual average wage paid to people and workers in the North at the moment is £10.58 an hour. And that, by the way, is an artificial figure because that includes the public sector, where wages in the North and Britain itself are effectively equalized, whereas in the private sector, they're much worse than that. So the material base of Orangism, which promised Protestant workers, you're first off the dole queue, you're first to get into a house, you join the Orange Order, and this in turn puts you in touch with unionist leaders at the top of the state, the material base has wilted. That does not mean that people simply respond to say, oh my God, it's terrible here, let's now move to a different position. It depends very much on the ideology and the politics that is on offer. And therefore, I would say that the emergence of people for profit in forming branches in West Belfast, which is the heartland of the provisional IRA, in beating the Sinn Féin to at least retaining 1 seat as against 4 in West Belfast, and then now beginning to expand into East Belfast, mainly a Protestant area. This offers a different type of alternative. And just to repeat, the alternative we're talking about is one where Irish unity is conceived of as a radical attack on two existing states, where workers from both communities and none will actually make significant benefits. That, I think, is the prospect of United Ireland that we can hope for.